Let's get to some serious business and hear from our speaker, Greg Cook.
Well, thank you all. As you can see, this is about architecture. I'm an architect. I kind of love talking about architecture, but in reality, this is about Chicago. And that's probably the thing I love as much as I like the architecture. So just so, if Ken's still here, I mean, he'll know when he can leave. I'm going to be talking about the spirit of Chicago, what Chicago was like in 1888, Ferdinand Peck and the idea of this exhibition, the committee that actually was formed in the Union League Club to make this happen. I'm going to talk about our success and the fact that we actually got the bid, which is pretty amazing. The design process as an architect, which is to me extremely fascinating, is how do you take an idea where no one had any experience at all and actually make it happen? We're going to talk about Olmsted, which, you know, I'll get to that. We're going to talk about the site where it actually is occurring. How do you select architects in a city that has a lot of architects? The building materials and timing, which is kind of important, especially when you're considering in 1893 everything was by horse and some steam locomotives. The first meeting of all the architects was kind of meaningful. Artists and sculptors and what that meant in terms of this particular exhibition. Construction logistics, you know, I'll get to that. Key pavilions and contents, what happened to the fair, the legacy and the after effect, and then we're going to talk about, I said, how the Columbian Exposition affected architecture. I'm going to talk a little bit about tragedy, so, you know, I want to keep people around a little bit. And then the Beaux Arts Design and City Beautiful movement, changing directions, and then I'm going to end with the Century of Progress, which is 1933 and 1935. So that is the agenda, so you know, you guys can decide when you have to exit. So in terms of the spirit of Chicago, this is where we need to start. The City of Chicago flag. The 4 stars are extremely meaningful in terms of what Chicago is really all about. So the first thing is, the first star is Fort Dearborn. And Fort Dearborn was in 1803, and there was a battle in 1812. So then after that, we got a big fire. That was 1871. Okay? This was a big deal, especially for us architects. Okay? So there's some more of the fire. You know, we like a good fire. And then we've got the Century of Progress, which was the 4th star. So those were the 4 stars that are represented on the flag. I mean, the real question at the end of this is, will there ever be a 5th star? So anyways, this story is about the Columbian Exposition. So, you know, what is it that you really need to know? What is the basic facts? The Columbian Exposition lasted for 6 months. Started in May of 1893 and it ended in October of 1893. There was 27 million visitors, 19 million of them were foreign. That's unbelievable. The most amazing effect is people that came here had never ever seen anything like this. This was the very first Disneyland. This is all a stage set. The buildings were made out, well, I'll get to that, but nothing was really real, but using Rich, for example, a lot of the folks were coming from farms and things like that. This was, the whole city was electric. They'd never seen electricity. There was one man that actually went nuts when he went to the electricity thing because they had a display that looked like lightning, and he actually had an event where he couldn't handle it, and they had to put him into a sanitarium. I mean, it was that mind-boggling. It was just unbelievable in terms of what they were able to accomplish. So anyways, what was our city in 1888? Because when the first bid started, it was 1888. The fair was built, you know, by 1893. But you know, the well-to-do of the city were terribly alarmed. I mean, this was just after the Haymarket riots, 1886, and that was where labor was trying to get an 8-hour workday. Policemen were killed. There was a whole bunch of things. There was, as a result of it, there was, you know, several murders. The labor unions were just they were trying to get an industrialized city that was under siege, more or less. The government was captured by the Irish, so they used the democratic process that was not necessarily to the benefit of the business community. So anyways, those that had money were really concerned about their city. They wanted it to be a major city. But the reputation of the city was gritty. It was industrial. It was nasty. It was the slaughterhouses. It was all of the things that go along with an industrialized city that grows quickly. The immigration that came here, there was slums all over the place, which is part of the reason why they had a fire, by the way. But they were looking to architecture as a way of trying to restore some of that order. So here we got Peck and the idea. Well, Ferdinand Peck, really interesting man. He's a developer. And he noticed that in the city of Chicago, that there was a whole lot of different music venues and all these kinds of things, but there was no major concert hall or anything of that like in the city of Chicago. So he took that as an opportunity, and he decided he was going to build the finest concert hall in the whole world. And he definitely wanted to outdo New York. You'll find throughout this whole thing, it's all about outdoing New York. So what he did is the Auditorium Theater. Now, the Auditorium Theater, he hired Adler and Sullivan. Adler was a master of engineering and acoustic genius. When they finished this, it was deemed to be the finest music hall in the world. It was covered by all of the newspapers. It was a really big deal, and it was so unbelievably beautiful. The decoration that Sullivan put on the inside and the acoustics that went along with it, it was just a masterful type of thing. It also was one of the very first mixed-use buildings around, because as a developer, he figured out that he won't get enough revenue out of the theater side, so he put offices in, he put in retail in, and he put in hotel. So he made it as a mixed-use development, and it was really a masterful thing. So anyways, after he did this, and it was so successful, he was looking for another gig. So here's where the Union League Club comes in. So anyways, he came to the club, and they formed a committee to try to go after this particular thing. So here's what's on the committee. We got Marshall Fields, merchandiser. We got Martin Ryerson. Ryerson Steel, but at that point it was lumber. We've got Pullman for rail cars, and all the people in blue are members of the club. The others were people that were part of the committee, maybe not part of the club. We've got Potter Palmer Hotel. We got Charles Yerkes, which was also considered the king of graft, but he was the one who built the L system and the surface railway. We've got Charles Hutchinson, which was a trader, and he was the founder of the Art Institute. We've got Cyrus McCormick, Farm Implements. We got Joseph Medill, which is the publisher of the Tribune. Edward Jeffrey, Illinois Central Railroad. And we've got Lyman Gage, the city's leading banker. Harlow Higboon, which turned out to be really important, but he was Marshall Field's partner. Now, not only did we have these that represented the very well-to-do families, but they also went and they sold shares to as clerks and salesmen. 30,000 people pledged, $10 or more shares to do this. So it was a big event. It went to a lot of people. Now, when we started going after this, you need to know that we were going against some pretty stiff competition, because the ones that went against it was not only us, it was St. Louis, it was Boston, Washington, D.C., and New York. So those were all of the different cities that decided they wanted to house the fair. So anyways, I'm skipping a lot of the detail, but I'm trying to get to the good stuff. But the bottom line is, we won the bid. And this is kind of things that is probably most interesting is, people think that the Windy City is because we're windy. It has absolutely nothing to do with that. The Windy City came from Charles Dana, which was the editor of the New York Sun, and what he said is, don't pay any attention to the nonsensical claims of the Windy City. Its people could not build a World's Fair even if they won it. Now, where that came from is when we presented our bid to Congress, our oratory was so long and it was so boastful that it upset New York to no end. Yeah. Okay, But what really, we won the bid on the 8th ballot, so it wasn't like this was a slam dunk. So this was, there was a real, back and forth going in terms of the negotiation. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get used to this. So what actually won it was the fact that we had unrivaled railroad connections. We're in the center of the country. So we've got a lot of good things going here. We also had had a history of large municipal projects. The reversal of the Chicago River was a really big deal, and the whole world knew it, especially since it ended typhoid fever in Chicago. The Auditorium Theater played a much bigger role than you think, because the Republican convention to elect the current president occurred in the Auditorium Theater before it was even finished. So he had been in Chicago, he was really familiar with it, and he could see the things that were able to occur. We just got things done. So the fact that we could do large projects, and then the final piece was, while they were still negotiating to try to get the bid, Higblum raised another $4 million in the pledge. So that didn't hurt. So anyways, we were successful. Oops, wrong one. Try this one. Okay, so now the design process. This is the part, as an architect, we get really excited about. What do you do now? And you have no idea how many times I've been in this position, okay? You work really hard to get the job, and you get the job, and it's like, oh geez, now I've got the job. Okay? It's not as easy as you think. So here comes Burnham and Root. Burnham's the guy on the left, Root's the guy on the right. They were the most prolific practice in Chicago, by far. The familiar buildings, okay, right next door, the Monadnock, at least the north half, it's the largest masonry bearing wall building in the world. The south half we did, but they did the north half. Then we also, they were the Rookery. That's where their headquarters were, and that's where they were out of. But they're a great company by far. They were a good choice to be the ones to try to organize the building portion. Now, as part of the bid, when they took on that assignment, they agreed they would not design any of the buildings in the fair. That proved to be wrong, but that was the agreement, okay? So anyways, they've got it. They had a really good practice. They worked together, kind of like a marriage. So anyways, they decided the first thing you have to do is you have to come up with a concept. What is going to be the theme that this fair is going to do? And so they decided first on, they wanted to have a water theme because it was a discovery of America. It was, this is about Columbus discovering the United States. So they did the water, they did the land, and they also wanted to play on the notion of discovery. So the whole idea of the fantasy land and just trying to constantly having people see things they've never seen before was the concept. And you have to have a basic concept that is overriding for all of your other decisions, or else architecturally it makes no sense. So anyways, our first hire, this is really key, is Olmsted. Frederick Law Olmsted, by far, was the most prolific landscape architect that America has ever seen. He was familiar with Chicago because before this he laid out the suburb of Riverside. Very, very talented. He was hired for this reluctantly because, like I said, he knew Chicago. Okay, so anyways, Burnham went out there, talked him into it. He came on board. And so now they need to start doing it. So the site, this is kind of important because in terms of the site, I've got to find my little notes here. They were considering 3 sites. The first site that was considered is the north side, and it was Lincoln Park. The second part that they considered was Washington Park, which is southwest. And then the third part was undeveloped land, which is now Jackson Park. Now, between the 3 sites, Olmsted by far preferred Lincoln Park because of its proximity to the downtown. But the railroad interests that were on the club, or on the committee, vetoed that because they didn't have access on the north side, but they did have access on the south side. So Jackson Park was chosen. Olmsted's response to this is, of all of the choices, this is the least park-like of all. Because what did they have? Well, let me show you the site first. Okay, so this shows what they were actually putting together And here it gives you the kind of what you need to know. There is 689 acres available. It went from 56th Street on the north to 67th Street on the south, from Lake Michigan to Stony Island on the west. Now, on top of that, there's the Midway, which is right here. So the main site is right in here. That is it. And in reality, it wasn't one site, it was actually 3 sites. So this is the one that everybody sees the most of. And it's nestled between the water entry, which is here, and the railroad entry, which is here. Up above it is was the state pavilions and the foreign pavilions. And then we had the Midway Palisades, which was over here. And that's still called the Midway. If you're at the University of Chicago, that's the strip of land that actually goes right through at that same area. So it was a gigantic site. So, and this is kind of what it looked like after it was built out. You can kind of get those kind of bearings that I was already showing you. This is what it looked like when they started, okay? So what they had was essentially 3 sandbars that ran parallel to Lake Michigan. They were filled with reeds, scrub brush, and all sorts of stuff. It was a bog. There was nothing here at all. So there was nothing that was existing. It had to be completely built. So anyways, the next thing after they've got the site, they've got the landscape guy. Now they got to get some architects. Let me back up this. Here's where the difficulty comes. Chicago had architects. Burnham and Root was the most prolific firm. If you want to have design, some consistency in your design, the best thing to do is you hire one person, and then you can kind of design things the same. Politically, you got a little bit of an issue because who do you choose? And there's a fair amount of architects here already. More importantly, there's going to be 200 structures. Burnham knew that this was a much bigger problem than what could be done in, with the Chicago architects. This, and especially considering where they're coming from. So what he did is, he was a very smart man. He went to the, first of all, we went to Congress. So Congress is funding this. So you still have to get the approvals from Congress. I mean, he had to do everything. He had to come up with a solution, plus he had to talk people into the solution. So what he came up with, he said, look, I want permission to go to New York and Boston, Kansas City. I'm going to hire 5 out-of-town architects. And I'm going to give those 5 architects the problem on how to develop the rules so that we can have a consistent look for the style. He delegated. And then after that, I'm going to come to Chicago and I'm going to hire 5 more architects. But not until I've already set up those people. So what he did is, he figured out a way of getting past the politics. He went to, New York was much larger and established than we were. Most of the folks in New York were already trained in the École des Beaux-Arts, whereas the architects in Chicago were not necessarily trained in the École, which is the traditional school in Europe. So he kind of figured out how to solution the problem before actually going forward and talking to the folks that you would think he'd talk to. They bought into it, which was a good thing. Now, when he went to New York, in particular, to talk to them about doing this, his response was no, because they were really upset with Chicago because we won the bid. So he had to talk them into it. And not only did he have to talk them into it, he had to actually plead with them to do it. So what he did is he invoked actually this nationalism. Be part of this. And the thing that was really cool about it is he actually did take what was supposed to be a national effort, and he made it a national effort, which was pretty amazing. I mean, that's the part that I find so mind-boggling when I was reading and doing all the research in this, is how you do this. Because I've been in some of these responsibilities, and like I tell you, I have not been as successful as him. So anyways, here's what he did. And after he got the folks, he assigned the buildings that were probably most suited for what they did. So he had Richard Hunt, and he did the administration building. He picked Peabody and Stearns. They were from Boston, and they did the agricultural building. George Post was the manufacturers and liberal arts. Van Brunt and Howe did electricity. They were from Kansas City. Solomon Beeman was from Chicago. Adler and Sullivan was from Chicago. Henry Oscalv was from Chicago. Berlin Whitehouse was from Chicago. And then William LeBaron Jennings was from Chicago. And William LeBaron Jennings essentially is the father of pretty much every other architect in all of Chicago because he invented essentially the steel structure. And he learned his structural engineering when Sherman's march to the sea. He was basically destroying all the bridges of the Confederacy, which taught him how structure worked. So it was pretty incredible. So again, all the blue people, Union League Club members, key. Okay, so materials and building. Now, again, I'm into process. How do you figure these things out? Again, I'm going to keep reiterating. Horses, steam locomotives. That's how you do material handling in 1893. 200 buildings. Here's what they did. They decided to build all the buildings out of plaster because you don't have to move brick, you don't have to move all of that, the stuff, so you could make the material on site. That was really important, that you could actually build it on site, and just, you had to move the plaster in, you got to move the cement that goes along with it, but they use what is called staff, and staff is a mixture of hemp and plaster, so marijuana essentially, to build your buildings. So, and the thing that was really important about it is you could mold it. You could make shapes. And at the end of the day, it's kind of like a stucco building. It's fairly durable. The buildings had to last 6 months. Okay, so the first meeting, this is kind of critical. So all of those architects, for the first time they come together. So on January 10th, 1891 was the very first site visit. They go down to the site. It happened to be a horrible day because it was January on Lake Michigan on the south side. So Robert Peabody, the guy from Boston, he climbs up to the top of the bluff. He yells down to Burnham. He says, "Do you really think you can have a fair here by 1893? It can't be done." Burnham said, "Well, I got to tell you, that decision's already been made." So that night, they have a dinner and a reception with not only the folks that have been chosen, but all of the architects in Chicago. And it was a very congenial, it was a very fun type of a thing. But the other architects still needed to be talked into it. So after a fair amount of liquor, they started talking about really what was important to Chicago and the architects. And what was really important was what I started with, the spirit of Chicago. We're used to getting things done and just being successful. Going from that Fort Dearborn to the fire to rebuilding, the whole notion of this fair was only 22 years after the fire. We rebuilt the whole city. I mean, it's pretty unbelievable when you think about this. Again, we love a good fire. So anyways, they talked about the spirit of Chicago. They talked about teamwork. They talked about cooperation. And then Burnham spoke, and he says, think of this as being the next event after 1776 and 1861. Well, those two things was the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. And when I first read this, I go, well, how do you make that tie? And basically what he was saying is, okay, these were events where you're an American and you gave of yourself for the purposes of the good of the country and others. And that was the whole point. And so and at the end of this, it actually brought the East Coasters really into it. And there was never another question about cooperation and teamwork after that point. Everybody really worked together, which was critical because there's no way you could have pulled this thing off if you didn't have everybody working together. So I showed you the staff and the plaster. Well, the other thing that what Burnham had told him is they said, look, in order to get this thing done, I'm hiring you, the architects, for the design. You won't be doing any field work. You won't be coming out to the things. We will handle all of the construction after you give me the design. And he needed that because this was such a huge undertaking. He had to be able to deploy all the construction forces as needed wherever it might be. So it was the biggest construction site ever. It was just incredible to kind of do this stuff. So anyways, here's why I got just Daniel Burnham. After that the first meeting and after the drinking, the second day, They were going to John Root's house for tea on Astor Street. They went there. John Root didn't come down. He was feeling ill. He died the next week. That was a big deal. So now Burnham is without his partner of the most prolific firm in the city, his design partner. And he's got this big problem with this fair. So he's kind of a little bit stuck. So there was a little bit of like, okay, what do I do now? And then he got together and he goes, okay, I need another design partner. So he contacted the folks he knew in New York, and he said, what can I do? Well, they sent him to Columbia University. And at Columbia University, they had a guy that had graduated in the last couple of years, and they said he's a good designer. I think he'd be a good fit. His name was Charles Atwood. Burnham goes out to meet with him. The guy doesn't show up for the interview. Burnham's not real happy. So he heads off to the train. This guy comes and jumps in front of him and says, hey, I'm your interview. He goes, well, there's no need to reschedule. He goes to the train, goes back to Chicago. As soon as he gets back, he goes to his office. 4 hours later, Charles Atwood shows up at his office. Yeah. So anyways, he goes, okay, well, if you can make that kind of effort, I'll look. Yeah. He looked at his stuff. It was fabulous. Hired him on the spot. So anyways, now he's got a new design partner. So what did Burnham do? After he lost his partner, he doubled down on the convention, on the fair. He just decided, I'm going to make this happen. I mean, it was this persistence. It was this leadership. It was this just commitment to, what it is that needs to get done, for Chicago, for the profession, for the United States. I mean, it was a big deal. So anyways, the third meeting. At the third meeting, he asked all of the architects to bring their designs together. And this is the first one where you actually got to see what actually people were putting together. Now, the layout of what the site was going to be was all done essentially by Root with Olmsted. They had kind of figured out what the general arrangement was going to be. After they had the concept of the water and the land and all that kind of stuff, they kind of figured out what it was going to be. But at the very first meeting, what Burnham did, which was, again, brilliant, is he brought in, let's see if I got his pictures, this guy, Augustus St. Cardans, which was a sculptor. And he wanted to start getting artists involved quickly at the same time as the architects. So he sat and he watched these presentations, and he was completely blown away by the beauty and the intent and all of the things that there was going to happen for this thing. So what he did is he motivated all of the artists of the world, essentially in the United States, to become part of this effort as well. And so once you look at the buildings, you'll notice that they're all heavily decorated, which is part of classical architecture. And all of that was made on site. So it wasn't bought from a catalog. It was a whole bunch of folks making, plaster casts of decorations and sculptures and all this. All of that was built at the same time as they're building the buildings. So it's just an unbelievable cultural and creative effort that it took to make this building. So here's some of the stuff that they put together. It was truly beautiful, and it was truly incredible. So key pavilions and contents, and obviously 200 buildings, all of them had some significance. I'm only going to do like 8. Yeah. Otherwise you'll all be asleep. So anyways, I told you that Burnham and Root agreed that they wouldn't design any of the buildings. Here's the first lie. So anyways, Burnham was having trouble with a couple buildings in terms of how they were coming together, and one of which was the peristyle. So he went to the office, and he was not as involved in the office. He had kind of turned it over to the office staff because he was very involved in the fair. So he talked to Atwood, and he says, look, this isn't working. You got any ideas? Atwood pulls the design out of his desk. It was already done. Okay? And then he looked at it and he goes, oh my God, this is beautiful. Now, what the peristyles was supposed to represent, it's got 48 columns. All of them are Corinthian columns, but it was intended to indicate one column for every state and territory that was in existence at the time. So it was kind of the water entry to the park. So it was kind of a big deal because that was, what you saw as you started to come. Now, as I showed you in the plan, the main site was between the water entry and the railroad entry. And the way that they set that up is In reality, they could handle 130,000 people an hour because of the way that they had set this thing up. So, I mean, it was very well planned. So going along with this, this is the water entry. That's a moving sidewalk. The pier is 250 feet wide, 2,500 feet long. So that's how they could handle a whole lot of people, because they could all come in and they can use a movable sidewalk. Again, 1893, electrically driven. So this is one of the first buildings. This one's Richard Hunt, and it's probably one of the most beautiful buildings. The main dome was, I think, I guess you probably find that. I know there's some people that actually know something about this, so I should probably get some facts. I think it was 275 feet tall, and it obviously was one of the more beautiful buildings on the site, you know, in terms of classical architecture. Hunt also did the Capitol Dome in Washington, so I mean, he actually knew something about classical architecture, and this is the way it looked. And going back to this for a second, you see that they're trying to build the water, you know, frontage at this point. I mean, it's, you know, they're building this, you know, basically, you know, they're forming the land, building the buildings, trying to make the lagoons all at the same time. I mean, it's not like, you know, okay, we're going to get the site totally prepared and then we'll start building buildings. Well, everything was going on at once. Once construction started, by the way, Burnham had a shack built for himself, and he stayed there. He only went to his house on the weekends. Now, this shack wasn't so bad. It had a fireplace and a wine cellar. Okay, so there's the building finished. Now, part of what they were considering when they were doing this was kind of a Venetian city. So it had gondolas, and they also had all sorts of transports that were essentially water taxis. They were all electrically driven. You know, the gondolas were hand, but I mean, the rest were all electric. So the city, as a city, this was unbelievably amazing. Now, this one here is Machinery Hall, and it was by Peabody and Stearns. This is the guy that was from Boston. And it's a very nice building. You know, show you some of this, and I'm going to try to get to it, and then kind of show you what's in there. The exhibits that were in here were equally as amazing as any of the buildings. Now, kind of what the main concept in terms of how they laid the buildings out was the ones that are on the main court were supposed to be themed buildings. So the exhibits that were in there were from every country. So if it was machinery, it was from all over the world. If it was the agriculture building, it was from all over the world. The fisheries building, they had, you know, the way people fished in every nation. You know, it was actually pretty cool. When you got to the northern area, which was the states and the foreigns, then it was themed to that particular country or that state. So, you know, that's why there was kind of a little difference between all of them, each of them. And then when you got to the midway, that was a whole different world. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, okay, agricultural building, you know, again, this is right on there. I'm not going to push these too hard. But this one, the manufacturer's building, let's see if I can do this. There's a person right there. This particular building here was under roof 30 acres. It was 1.3 million square feet. It was gigantic. Now, I mentioned that this fair was built in 2 years. And in those 2 years, there was also 2 winters. This one didn't do well in the first winter. They had already put the roof on heavy snow. They had a bad snowstorm. Half the roof fell in, and they had to rebuild it again. In that same storm, it blew down some of the buildings. I mean, it was hard to accomplish what they did with this thing. Yeah, so you're just kind of showing the inside. Manufacturer's building. Again, all of that decoration was all built on site by the artists at the same time that they're building the buildings. So the coordination of this was just unbelievably incredible. Now, I'm going to back up a little bit. The classicism of the site, the bridges, the balustrades, and all of the things that gave it that Italian Renaissance look, that was actually designed by Codman, which was the partner of Olmsted. And he was his young partner. So Olmsted was pretty established. Like I said, he's the most prolific landscape architect in the world. Well, probably, well, just America at least. But Codman had been trained in France. So he had classical training. So all of the things that were authentic in terms of that was by Codman, not by Olmsted. Olmsted was more of a naturalist. So the wooded island, which was in the middle of the pond that was over by the art building, that was all natural, and it had the largest collection of roses in the world and all this kind of stuff. That was more Olmsted. This stuff was all Codman. Now, Henry Ives Cobb, he's a local. What kind of made this one kind of fun, and the reason I want to put it, I'll show you the next slide. At the same time he was doing this, he was doing the University of Chicago. It opened the same year. He also was responsible for the Newberry Library, Potter Palmer Mansion, Chicago Athletic Association. Those were later, but you know, it was just incredible how these people were able to do all this stuff. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Fine Arts Building. Here's the second lie. This is the other one that Burnham thought he was having trouble getting a good design, so he did the same thing with Atwood, and Atwood pulled this out. By the way, this is the only building that is still standing. It was the Palace of Fine Arts. It now is the Museum of Science and Industry. And when it was built, the entry was from the pond, which was currently the backside of the building. Okay, so after the fair, it fell into disrepair to some, and here's what happened. After the fair, a lot of the exhibits didn't go back to their countries, you know, especially like the mining and stuff like that. You know, the people, you know, they didn't want to ship it back. So that's what started our field museum. So they bought or took a lot of the exhibits that didn't go back. They were moved to this particular building, and this was the field museum until the field museum was built, and then after that it was empty. The chairman of Sears thought that was a travesty, had the building 100% rebuilt out of limestone, exactly the way it was when it was in the fair. And then and then he started the Museum of Science and Industry, which is the very first interactive, you know, science museum of in the country. So that was kind of the inside of it at the time. Some of the art that came in, this was kind of interesting. When they first were proposing the buildings and how they were going to do it, France at first said that they would not ship any art here because they were afraid that Chicago would burn down again. So of all of the buildings that were built, it was a little bit more permanent than the others, and that is part of the reason why it is on a pond. But it had some pretty cool art in there as well. Yeah. So Jenny, this is the guy I told you is the father of all architecture in Chicago, and so this was probably the best one for him in terms of trying to show structural steel and how it could be made. Again, when I looked at some of the interior shots in this, it was really a cool building in terms of the things, and they had a 60-foot column of oranges that was topped by lemons, you know, and that was from California, so it just sounded fun. So okay, now I want to talk a little bit about this a little bit more. And there was one exhibit hall that was called the Women's Building, and it was kind of important because the women in Chicago were more than just putting on charity balls. They were really active. This was an important time for Chicago and actually the nation for women because it was before women's suffrage, it was before they had the vote. There was a whole contingent of women that were actually pretty radical. But there was also a fair amount, when they did this building, it's the only building that had a competition. And they went out and they sought only women architects, and it was won by Sophia Hayden. She was a recent graduate from MIT. So she won this thing, she got the building built. After it was finished, she had a nervous breakdown, never built another building. But anyways, after they had the building, there was a big fight amongst the women in terms of what the message should be. And it was a fight between the radicals, which really wanted to, you know, push women's rights at all costs and nothing else. There were the Isabellists, and what their point was is Isabel is the one who commissioned Christopher Columbus. The Queen of Spain was equally as important as Columbus. Why aren't we celebrating her? And then there was the folks that just really liked the joy of being a woman. So it was a pretty interesting fight between these three groups in terms of what it really should be. Because, the ones that actually like they said, what's wrong with the nurturing aspects that we have? What is wrong with education? What is wrong with the stuff that really makes us special as women? So, this is part of what made the fair so important, was the dialogue. I told you in the beginning, they wanted to have this sense of discovery. Every single one of these buildings is a building, but you know what? As an architect, it's not the building. It's what's in the building that is really important, and that's what the whole fair was about, was what is going on in the world? And that was what people found so amazing, is because everything that they saw they had never seen before. There was something here for everybody, bar none. There was nobody that could possibly have gotten bored or couldn't find something that was interesting. So anyways, that is her building. It was placed a little bit off of the main area, which is, again, a kind of a testament in terms of how women were being treated by men. Okay, so, and then that's kind of the inside. But it actually had 7,000 volumes of books that were written by women. It had lectures continuously, so they did try to appease all of those different factions. It was very meaningful for Chicago in terms of trying to promote what really are a woman's place in the world. So anyway, the electricity building. This was probably the thing that most people found so amazing. The whole fair was run by electricity. They had displays by Westinghouse, they had Tesla, they had dynamos of all sorts of different things. The things that they had in terms of machinery and things in this fair were unbelievable. People would come at night just to see the illumination and all the stuff that they were doing. Everything about this fair was just amazing. The transportation building. Now this is Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan is our rabble-rouser. He's the one architect that, just is never happy. And he actually was classically trained. He went to the École des Beaux-Arts. So of all of the buildings, they called it the White City because all the buildings were made out of plaster and they're all painted white. And the other rule that they came up in the beginning was the cornice line would be at 50 feet. Well, we've got Louis coming here. He makes a building with color. And it was gold leaf. And he's the same guy that did the decoration inside the auditorium theater. It actually truly was an amazingly beautiful building. And then you get to the inside, which, this is the transportation building. One end of it is carriages, the other end of it's steam locomotives. And there's everything in between. This is before the car, so it's what we think of now is quite a bit different than, what's occurring in 1893. And then we've got, like I said, the second area of the fair, which was the state and the foreign buildings, and they didn't have the same rules. So it was haphazard, different shapes, different sizes, but it was supposed to represent the culture of the state, the culture of the country. So, that's appropriate, but it was a lot different than the main area where, everybody sees the main pictures of. Now this I found really amazing. This is the Krupp Exposition, which is Germany. Again, 1893, they spent $1 million to bring the biggest cannon ever made. Think about it, this is before World War I. So this is a pretty strong statement, coming from Germany. And it's just like, I couldn't believe that they would do this, but they wanted to tell people where they stood. So, and that's, again, the fair was really important for the discourse, the discussions, the discovery. What does it mean? And that's what a fair should be. It shouldn't be just going there and looking at a museum. It should evoke some kind of a feeling or some kind of knowledge. Now this was fun. Burnham, the other competition Burnham had was he sent out a competition because he said, we want to out-Eiffel the Eiffel Tower. Because the last World's Fair was in Paris in 1888. So he wanted to outdo it. So this was the movable Eiffel Tower. It was done by George Washington Ferris. It had 36 cars. Each car could hold 40 people. It was about twice as big as the one that's on Navy Pier right now. It was gigantic. It's the only thing in the fair that actually earned a profit. It was 50 cents to make 2 revolutions, and it ended up with $750,000 positive. He paid for it himself, so he got to keep the money. And then after it moved to 2 other cities, and then it ended up scrap. So what happened to the fair? Now, like I told you, this was a 6-month event. That's the way it was intended. That's the way it was. So anyways, on January 8th, 1894, there was a fire. And that fire took down the peristyle first at those columns building. On both ends of it, one was the casino, the other end was a music hall. Those all caught fire. And they went down. Suspicious origins, okay? So then legacy and after effect. Here's the part that, that is important. Economically, for the city of Chicago, this was a really big deal. The panic of 1893 had kind of shut down the country. We were rolling pretty good. It was one of the largest construction sites ever, so it pretty much employed a lot of folks. Reputation. Chicago's reputation was not real good. After this, it changed drastically in terms of what we could accomplish, what we created, the wonder of it all. We just became, the bar was raised to a degree that no one had ever seen before, ever. And then we got access to world markets. Probably one of the coolest things was the art of Chicago, of the United States, was not appreciated at all in Europe. After the Europeans that came here, the markets to especially artists increased drastically. And the reputation of the United States and what we could accomplish and all that opened up for everyone. So the world market, it accomplished a real lot. So when you call it a World's Fair, it really made a difference. And then architectural awareness. By far, that was probably the huge. I mean, Chicago's stature as an architectural capital started with the Columbian Exposition because of what Burnham was able to accomplish, along with other groups that he worked with. Now we got the tragedy section. You got to have tragedy. Henry Sargent Cott, let's start with Holabird Root. That's the guy that died 1 week after the first meeting of all of the architects, after laying out the entire fair. He was the partner. And then we got Henry Sargent Codman, the young partner to Frederick Law Olmsted. While they were building the fair, he was directing everybody in terms of where the ponds were going to be, how the walls were going to be, and all that kind of stuff. He had an appendicitis. He had surgery, got infection, and he died. Okay, then we've got, let's do Mayor Carter Harrison next. Okay, the fair closed on October 30th, 1893. On October 28th, 1893, the mayor was hosting all of the major city mayors, just before the closing. And so they were all there. There was a great event. He went home that night. While he was getting ready to go to a dinner, somebody came to his house and assassinated him. So the closing on October 30th, 1893 was actually his funeral. So then we got Charles Atwood, the guy that didn't show up for his interview. So after the fair, they went back, Burnham and Root, kept going, so Atwood started to not show up for work. Burnham fired him. And he was a partner. He got rid of him. 3 weeks later, he was dead. So now Burnham's got a new problem. The newspapers are saying, killed 2 partners in 4 years. This is only 4 years between the 2 of them. The newspapers claim that he died from overwork. And this guy was very prolific. I mean, like I said, those designs that he pulled out of his desk, he truly pulled out of his desk. It turns out he was an opium addict. And that's why he was able to produce so much, because he was a drug addict. Okay, then we got H.H. Holmes. Now, any of you have happened to read Devil in the White City, you know about H.H. Holmes. They're not exactly sure how many people he killed, but he took advantage of what the fair brought in terms of people that really didn't know what they were doing, and he just basically killed a whole lot of folks. So then the rest of the tragedy is, at the end of the fair, it put a real lot of people out of work. And this was during a pretty rough period of America. So we went from this unbelievable economic boom to an unbelievable economic bust. And it was really awful, social-wise and everything else. And so we had to deal with all the homeless and all the people that, they couldn't afford anything because it all stopped. And it stopped on that day. So what was truly what I consider the greatest tragedy was the white city, separate but equal. Now, we had actually a pretty strong black community, African-American community in Chicago. The person that founded Chicago, Baptiste DeSable, was black. The women were able to get their building by having connection to wealthy men. The blacks never got a voice. They tried, they were pushed aside. The biggest tragedy of all, they tried to appease them by having a colored day. And that kind of gave credence to what the South was doing, separate but equal. So unfortunately, Chicago was part of something that was pretty sad, in terms of equality and what the United States really is supposed to be part of. So anyways, what happened after it? We're going to talk a little bit. Now I'm going to talk about Beaux Arts and the design. Now, Beaux Arts, what that means is all of the classically designed architects went to the school of École de Beaux Arts, which was in France. And over here I brought a pattern book from the École de Beaux Arts, which belonged to John Root. It was from the collection of our firm. And it shows you, the styles that are approved classical styles that were used in terms of designing classical buildings. So after the fair, classical was considered to be a reasonable style. So everybody, and when they saw what happened at the White City in terms of how it actually kind of solved all the problems of a city, every city wanted to have a Beaux Arts building in their core. So I'm kind of showing you stuff that our firm did, but this is City Hall. We did that. Right after that, we did Soldiers Field. Because it's all classically designed. It's okay for, municipal buildings. And then I showed you kind of our competition. We made a high-rise Gothic building for the University Club. So anyways, Sullivan, he's our rabble-rouser, remember? He said, the violent outbreak of classic romanticism and bogus antique, it cut short the promising movement of original American architecture in Chicago. Thus, architecture died in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Okay? And the thing is, him and his protege, Frank Lloyd Wright, really believed this. So here's what happened. Adler and Sullivan, Sullivan refused to do a classical building. As a firm, he ceased to exist in 1895. As a firm, our firm started to really ascend. So that wasn't so bad. So changing directions. Okay, now we got to change directions. Now, he had some truth in what he was saying. The classicism really is not an innovative or new American stylistic design, but he's right. Architects really wanted to come up with a new style, something that is really, truly reflective of today. So we started to change directions. And I'm using the wrong clicker. So anyways, let me start. Here's where it really started to change. And this is the other book I brought. And I brought our firm's copy of the 1922 Tribune Tower competition. That was a big deal because in 1922, by now, people were aware of what architecture could do. This was a big international competition. The first prize was on the left, which was by Hudenhaus. That's what was built. Second prize was Saarinen from Finland. The third prize was my firm's entry. So this was a big departure because if you looked at the book, a lot of the things are still classical, but they're trying to find a style that is kind of breaking away from classical, and it was the start of Art Deco. So, and another little side story. Hudenhaus actually won the competition, but they didn't do any of the drawings. Our firm did. So anyways, here's what we came up with after that. The Board of Trade, okay, very Art Deco. Palmolive Building, which was Playboy Towers for a long period of time. Oh, and the beacon on the top is called the Lindbergh Beacon. We designed it to be a tether for dirigible blimps. That was what its intent was. And then there's the building, when it was first built. Now, part of what I wanted to talk about in terms of the spirit of Chicago, you get this attitude, you get this momentum, and it kind of carries through. What happened in the Columbian Exposition in terms of trying to get Chicago to feel good and the architects to feel good and all this kind of stuff carried forth, and especially when they started to want to have a new American style. Century of Progress was in 1933, 1935. It was truly a new modern American style. So again, I'm featuring our buildings, but this is the Chrysler Motors Pavilion that Holabird Root did. This is the Nash Pavilion that we did, and the one in the back was another building that we were part of as well. But it was way different, in terms of what you saw from the Columbian Exposition. And that's the end of my talk, so I'll take some questions.